Hi, everyone, and welcome to the last panel of the day in the 6th edition of our Data Journalism and Digital Methods Conference, CODA. My name is Natalia Mazzotti, and I'm co-founder of School of Data in Brazil and Journalism Associate Dean at INSPER University, where I coordinate a data journalism graduate program. CODA is organized by School of Data Brazil and developed in partnership with the Google News Initiative. I'm super happy to announce that this panel marks the launch of the Portuguese version of Data Journalism Handbook towards a critical data practice, produced by the European Journalism Center in partnership with Google News Initiative. The Portuguese version was organized by INSPER University together with School of Data Brazil and ABRAGE, the Brazilian Association of Investigative Journalism. The second edition of the book, considered a reference by the community in the area, provides an overview of data journalism in the world today and presents future challenges. And this is what we will discuss in this session. And I'm honored to have with me Jonathan Gray, Liliana Bounegru, and Cedric Lomion, who I've known for almost a decade from open knowledge festivals and School of Data activities around the world. So before we start, let me introduce our guests here. Cedric Lomion is the Data and Innovation Lead at the Open Knowledge Foundation. He is based in France, but has worked over the world with local and international organizations on data literacy projects, including dozens of newsrooms. When he's not coordinating training and data literacy programs on behalf of the Open Knowledge Foundation, Cedric teaches data journalism at the Journalism Institute of Bordeaux, France. Jonathan Gray is senior lecturer in critical infrastructure studies at the Department of Digital Humanities, King's College, London, where he's currently writing a book on data worlds. He is also co-founder of the Public Data Lab and research associate at the Digital Methods Initiative in the University of Amsterdam, and also the Media Lab at Sciences Po, Paris. Together with Liliana Bounegru, he recently co-edited the Data Journalism Handbook, which is now also in Portuguese. And finally, let me introduce Liliana Bounegru, who is a lecturer in digital methods at the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College, London as well. She's a research associate at the Digital Methods Initiative and Sciences Po in Paris. And she co-founded the Public Data Lab, a network of research labs which seeks to facilitate research, democratic engagement, and public debate around the future of the data society. Previously, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute and obtained her double PhD degree from the University of Groningen and Ghent University. So welcome and thank you so much for being with us. Before we move to our conversation, I would like to invite Liliana to share a little bit more about the Data Journalism Handbook and the reflections that the book proposed. So please, Liliana, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Natalia. I will be sharing my screen now. Great. So, hi everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation, Natalia, and thank you to the entire organizing team for the amazing work that you have done to make this event happen. And I would also like to thank Natalia and the wonderful team of volunteers for getting the second edition of the Data Journalism Handbook translated into Portuguese, which is also the occasion that we are celebrating with this panel. So it's a pleasure to be on this panel and share some insights from the second edition of the Data Journalism Handbook. And more specifically, what I would like to do in this time that I have kindly been offered to introduce the book is to offer 3 challenges for a critical data journalism practice. And I will speak for about 20-30 minutes, and Jonathan will take over for the Q&A. So I will start with a few words about the book. So the book is open access and can be freely downloaded online. The first edition of the book was published in 2012, so that's close to a decade ago. And in this time, it has become an important reference point in this field and has been translated into more than 12 languages. And what the 2012 edition did was really to capture the enthusiasm associated with the early days of this practice being recognized. And now, close to a decade later, we are at the point where the practice is both more established, more mature, but also more questioned, given that we are in this moment which has been called a post-truth or a post-fact moment. So this is why the subtitle of the second edition, published this year, is Towards a Critical Data Practice. So why is that? Well, it's because what we wanted to do with this book was to enrich the stories that we tell about data journalism and to account for these practices a little bit differently than the first edition. So what do I mean by that? And let me give an example. If you work in data journalism, you will know Simon Rogers, the former Guardian data journalist, now at the Google News Lab. So Simon has been and is a central figure in the data journalism space, and he has done seminal work to build recognition for data journalism as a practice, including securing support for this book, for which we are most grateful. And Simon's chapter in this book provides not only his journey in data journalism, but also a very good picture of the development of data journalism in mostly Western English-speaking countries over the past decade. So these developments are linked to transparency movements, efforts to open up government data and datafication, and to the availability of tools to clean, analyze, and visualize data. And what we wanted to do with this book is to ask, in addition to this picture of data journalism, what else is out there? And I think that this question of what else is out there is very well aligned with the theme of this panel, data journalism in the world and the intentions of its organizers. So what else enters the picture when we listen to a diversity of voices in this space? And that is really what we wanted to do with this book. We wanted to make space for different perspectives and provocations on data journalism. We wanted to see what happens when we broaden the frame to look at the social, cultural, political, and economic context in which data journalism practices are embedded. We wanted to offer a relational perspective on journalism data practices as a kind of a curatorial craft, assembling and working with diversities and infrastructures to generate different ways of knowing, narrating, and seeing the world at different scales and temporalities. And that's really what the book cover is also trying to suggest. And we're really grateful to the wonderful artist, Sarah T, and the museum where this piece was exhibited for the permission to use it for the book cover. So all of this in the book is really done through the voices of the book's authors. And this book is really a collective experiment in accounting for data journalism practices. It spans a wide range of voices and perspectives, both from data journalism researchers and from data journalism practitioners. It has more than 50 chapters from 74 authors, both researchers and practitioners from around the world. And we are really most grateful to the authors for their wonderful contributions. So it's hard to do justice to 50 chapters and 74 authors in such a short amount of time. So for the purposes of this panel, I organized the insights provided by the many authors of this book into 3 challenges or 3 principles for a critical data journalism practice. And this is what I'll use the rest of my intervention today to speak about. So what does a critical data journalism practice mean? And I would like to suggest that critical data journalism practice takes into account these 3 aspects: making stories both with and about data, finding alignments with marginalized issues and actors, and cultivating reflexive ways of telling. And I will illustrate each of these with arguments and examples provided by the authors of this book. So the first challenge is about making stories both with and about data and infrastructures and their associated power arrangements. To put it more simply, this is about what Emmanuel Didier, in his review of the book, refers to as data journalists as users and critics of data. This point is also about cultivating what could be called feminist data journalism, following Catherine D'Ignazio's chapter in the handbook. So according to D'Ignazio, taking a feminist approach to data journalism would involve a sensibility towards inequalities and biases inscribed in datasets and in algorithms as one works with them. This is also about data journalism that can be viewed as a form of data activism. That is, data journalism that doesn't just work within dominant regimes that turn every aspect of our lives into data. That is data journalism that also interrogates these data regimes and makes space for public involvement and intervention around data infrastructures, as really several really good data journalism projects have done in the past years. One important example of this is that in the data journalism space is the practice that is known as algorithmic accountability reporting. And the book contains an entire section on this topic of algorithmic accountability reporting. So algorithmic accountability reporting is a beat that is emerging in some newsrooms to critically scrutinize algorithms and data infrastructures. And in the words of computational data journalism expert Nick Diakopoulos, it is a reorientation of the traditional watchdog function of journalism towards algorithmic power. A well-known example of this practice is the machine bias series of the US investigative outlet ProPublica. And as many of you know, this series takes as an object of investigation the use of algorithms in various areas of society. For example, in the criminal justice system in the US to expose its racial bias. And the series also covers Facebook's ad targeting system, Amazon's pricing systems, and many other applications of algorithmic systems in society, which are deserving of closer examination. In his chapter for the book, Diakopoulos addresses the question of when an algorithm becomes newsworthy And what he also does is that he discusses a variety of methods that journalists use to investigate algorithmic power. So that's everything from reverse engineering to auditing techniques and what he calls low-tech techniques to critique algorithms based on observing their outputs and their reactions to user actions. The principle of doing investigations both with and about data infrastructures can also be applied to journalists' own infrastructures. And that is what another chapter in the book does. So in another book chapter, the lens of investigation is inverted and directed towards journalism-specific data infrastructures and how these may be reconfigured. Journalist and researcher Stefan Kunda takes up what he calls the platformization of cross-border investigative journalism. And specifically, he takes up the case of platforms that host data for collaborative investigations. So in his chapter, Kunda argues that while there is ample critique of social media platforms, so we've been hearing that a lot in the last years, investigative journalism platforms and how they are configuring the journalist as a user are also in need of closer scrutiny. So he proposes that having a very small number of monopolizing platforms in the global investigative journalism space can be understood as data feudalism. And this term of data feudalism draws on the work of internet critic Evgeny Morozov. So the chapter by Kunda discusses concerns about access control, issues of free labor, and governance issues associated with some investigative journalism platforms. And it also warns of how its gig economy model might be conducive of creating a precariat in investigative journalism. So Kunda's orientation as a journalist is towards reconfiguring models and infrastructures for collaboration in cross-border investigative journalism. So that means that instead of a small number of large investigative journalism platforms, he would like to see a multiplicity of independent networks organized around equitable governing principles and co-ownership models. Yeah, and Stefan is experimenting with setting up one such alternative network. Yeah, so those were just a couple of examples of how this principle of making stories with and about data and reconfiguring infrastructures is explored in the book. And there are several other chapters that look at this. And if you have any examples from your own work or the work of others, we would love to hear from you. So please do get in touch, and my contact details will be on the last slide. And also, when it comes to making stories with and about data, there is also much more that data journalists and researchers investigating the data society can learn from each other. So collaborations, not only between journalists, but also between journalists and researchers, are essential in investigations about algorithmic power and about unequal power distributions in the data society. So moving on, the second challenge that the authors of this book raised has to do with aligning projects with issues, actors, and interests marginalized by unequal arrangements in specific contexts. So very simply, this challenge is about asking the question, data journalism by whom, for whom, and in whose interests? And in the book, this question is raised by scholar and educator Marilyn Young, and journalist and researcher Candice Callison in their chapter, Data Journalism and Whose Interests. And they argue that these are important questions to ask, given that journalism in Western countries often plays a role, historically and now, intentionally or not, in maintaining social orders associated with the state, but also patriarchy, settler colonialism, and white supremacy. Taking the example of indigenous peoples, they discuss how data gathering about these groups has always been enmeshed with the project of settler colonialism. And they point to the risks of these archives now informing machinic ways of knowing, including in data journalism. In a different chapter, scholars and activists Tahu Kukutai and Maggie Walter call the data that emerge from statistical surveillance of indigenous populations as 5D data. So that's data that focus on difference, disparity, disadvantage, dysfunction, and deprivation. So these are data detailing indigenous overrepresentation in negative health, education, poverty, and incarceration rates, and which have negative implications for indigenous lives. In addition to misrepresentation by means of 5D data, another problem that Kukutai and Walter raise is what they call indigenous data deserts, so the absence of data on indigenous populations. Relatedly, in their chapter, Young and Callison point to how, in the context of media reporting in the United States, indigenous communities there are known as asterisk nations. So this points to how they are frequently represented in charts and graphs with an asterisk due to the absence of data on these groups. So, where does this leave data journalists working on projects involving indigenous peoples and issues? In their chapter, Kukutai and Walter discuss one set of practices that could help to mediate some of these risks and provide a starting point for critical data journalism practice involving indigenous peoples and issues. And this is indigenous data sovereignty, or IDSOV, as an emerging site of science and activism. So there are networks that are concerned with the rights of indigenous peoples to own, control, and access data derived from them and which pertains to various aspects of their lives. So there are several such networks that have been established in various parts of the world, and you can see some of these on the slide. These networks can represent valuable sources of data and expertise for data journalism. And the chapter by Kukutai and Walter also includes recommendations for data journalists working on stories involving indigenous peoples and issues, and who seek to align their projects with the interests of these communities and to make meaningful space for indigenous perspectives in journalistic stories. There are several other examples in the book on how data journalism projects could be aligned with issues, actors, and interests marginalized by unequal power structures in specific contexts. So there is this other chapter from data journalist Eva Constantaras on data journalism by, about, and for marginalized communities. When it comes to aligning projects with neglected issues, another chapter looks at citizen data journalism and citizen data activism practices in China. And this is specifically around key issues of concern, such as air pollution. And the chapter discusses example of citizen air pollution sensing, focused on aspects of air quality not monitored by official infrastructure. And it also discusses the well-known data storytelling project Under the Dome on the severity of the air quality crisis, which combines charts and graphics with voice narration. So these were a few examples of how this question of data journalism by whom, for whom, and in whose interest is explored by the authors of this book, and how space can be made for meaningful public participation in data projects. And again, I would like to extend the invitation to please get in touch if you have any other examples, as we would love to continue to find ways to explore and to feature such projects, because they are very important. Okay, so moving on to the final challenge. So the final challenge that I will talk about is cultivating what we call reflexive ways of telling. So what does that mean? It means developing storytelling styles that recognize that knowledge is always situated, provisional, plural, and it always comes with a degree of uncertainty. And for the sake of simplicity, I refer to all of these aspects as reflexive ways of telling. And I'll try to say a little bit more about what each of these means. So I'll start with a bit of the background that prompted this principle, which is provocatively summarized in one of the book chapters as data journalism as an empirically self-assured profession. So in his chapter, journalism researcher Chris Anderson describes data journalism in Western countries as an empirically self-assured profession. And if there are any data journalists in the audience, perhaps you could think about how you relate to this statement. But the chapter author really refers to a number of things with this statement. For example, there is generally a confidence amongst data journalism practitioners in Western countries that the field is on the rise and is generally doing well. There is also a positivist orientation in the field. So what does positivism mean? It means a belief that facts somehow speak for themselves once they have been properly prepared. And in his chapter, Anderson provides a genealogy of data journalism in the United States as a way to encourage self-reflexivity around this practice, and as a way to complement what he describes as the understandable and well-deserved self-confidence of this profession. So, two aspects of this principle of encouraging reflexive ways of telling or reflexive ways of storytelling are provisionality and uncertainty. And one of the recommendations that Anderson makes, based on his genealogy work, is to cultivate processes by means of which data journalism could better convey its own provisionality and uncertainty. And one of the areas that he suggests requires more attention is how uncertainty is represented in data journalism projects. And one example of how this could be materialized, we think, is offered by a data journalist in her chapter in the book. So this is the chapter by data journalist Mona Chalabi on sketching with data. And many of you may already be familiar with Mona Chalabi's work. So she argues that sketching with data is a way to reconfigure relations between the journalist and the reader. She argues that the medium of sketching with data can make the provisionality, uncertainty, partiality, and limitations of the visual representation more immediately accessible to the reader. This is another example from Chalabi's work, which she thinks is rather transparent about its shortcomings, yet it is very effective. So this example engages with the issue of endangered species by means of sketches that try to fit the remaining numbers of each endangered species into the same space. In this case, it's a New York subway carriage. So reflexive ways of telling or reflexive ways of storytelling also engage with the role of emotions. And here again, Mona Chalabi's work highlights the role of emotion when engaging with data visualization. Yeah, so this is a visualization that compares the size of a solitary confinement cell to that of a parking space in the US, and thereby makes it experienceable through the proxy of the parking space, to which many of us can relate. Several other chapters engage with this topic of emotions in data projects. And in their chapter, Helen Kennedy and her co-authors report on the important role that emotions play in people's everyday engagements with news data visualizations, which their research highlights. A similar observation is made by Caitlin Petre, this time about visualizations aimed at journalists themselves. And in her chapter on how journalists work with audience metrics, she argues that audience analytics dashboards are not really met with this dispassionate, rational interpretation that we expect from engagements with data, but they are met with emotional reactions. So for the journalists in the audience, this may be something that you may have experienced yourselves when working with audience metrics. Petra gives the example of Chartbeat, which of course many of you will know. It's a popular audience analytics dashboard for journalists. And the makers of this service designed it with particular emotional reactions in mind. So they want the service to be used, so they make sure that the design communicates deference to journalistic judgment, it softens the blow when traffic numbers are low, and that it also offers some opportunities for celebration when stories do well. Catherine D'Ignazio, in her chapter, draws attention to, of course, the ethical responsibilities that come with leveraging emotion in data journalistic work. And finally, reflexive ways of telling or reflexive ways of storytelling also cultivate plurality and situatedness. So what does this mean? It means that they value a multiplicity of knowledge forms and consider their situated aspects. So what does this situated aspects means? So the term comes from the work of feminist researcher Donna Haraway and refers to the obvious but often forgotten fact that all knowledge making, including journalistic knowledge making, is embedded in particular times, places, and contexts, and that these have implications for the knowledge we produce and for the stories that we tell. For example, in her chapter, media researcher Anita Sey-Chan argues that data journalists should aim to diversify their data sources and decenter methods that would privilege dominant analytical regimes, such as those associated with big data. She argues that data journalists should engage with bottom-up data practices. So, for example, the citizen sensing discussed earlier would be an example of this, as well as with efforts to resist big data. And of course, many interesting data journalism projects in the past years have done this and have done this really well. And again, I would love to hear any examples that you might have on this in the Q&A session. And this is again where alliances might be pursued, not only with computer scientists, but also with researchers in critical data studies, algorithm studies, software and platform studies, digital methods, internet studies, and post-colonial computing. And there are many interesting examples that we could think of here. But to conclude, I will give just one final example from the book that illustrates how data journalism can engage with diverse forms of media and experiential ways of knowing. So this is an example of participatory visual knowledge making that comes from the work of Chicas Poderosas. And many of you might know of the work of Chicas Poderosas. So this is a transnational network of journalists, designers, and programmers who work on participatory media projects with marginalized communities in South America. And this is an example from one of their workshops, which uses beading as a visualization medium to explore questions of identity in these communities. Yes, so those were a few ways in which this final principle of cultivating reflexive ways of telling can be explored in the context of data journalism. So I will stop here. I hope that I didn't take too much time. So this was a quick tour of some of the work in the book. The book is really rich. There is really a lot of material, so I tried to make justice to everything that is in the book. And I hope that this will provide some inspiration for ways of thinking about and doing critical data journalism practice. And again, I am sure that many of you will already be doing these things in your work. And we would love to hear more about some of your own experiences, some of your own practices and examples around these three challenges. Hopefully we will have a bit of time for that in the Q&A. Yeah, so please do share them in the Q&A or get in touch with us afterwards. We would really love to hear more about any of these themes. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Liliana. I think this is a great overview of the book, and I gotta say that you and Jonathan did such a wonderful job editing this new Data Journalism Handbook. The level of the discussions and questions that the book raises is super important for the field, and I will definitely use the time that we have here to discuss some of its main points. So thanks for this great introduction. My first question goes to all of you. I think Jonathan and Liliana also edited the first edition of the Data Journalism Handbook, right? Published almost a decade ago, while Cedric has been training journalists for several years now. So you three have a vast experience in this field. And I wonder if you could tell us what are the main changes you've seen in the practice of data journalism since the first edition of the Data Journalism Handbook. I will start with Jonathan.
Hello, so much has happened since the first edition. It was a very different moment, I think, when we were writing the book, which emerged in MozFest 2011 at a writing sprint with a number of different journalists and media organizations. And I guess it started as a way to just document what were then kind of emerging practices, and also the emergence of a field. Like I don't think that necessarily the sorts of practice that happened in the previous decade were called data journalism up until around the early kind of 2010s. I think Liliana also organized one of the first international conferences on data journalism in around 2010. So it was very much a field in the making at that point, 10 years ago. I guess just to mention three things which I think are important to consider about what's changed between now and then. Firstly, I think we knew this before, but we really know it now, and it's very much a topic of engagement these days, is we cannot take data for granted. And by that, I mean data has been challenged in all sorts of ways, but also the liberal and kind of market-based institutions, which often underpinned the production of data, and the sort of transnational set of institutions which often underpinned the production of data of various kinds, including through standard setting and so on, has seen some significant challenges politically from around the world over the last several years. Well, really since the last 5 years. So we can't take data for granted in all sorts of ways, for better and for worse. For better in, I think, understanding the production of data, telling more stories about the production of data and the politics of making data is actually, I think, ultimately a good thing, which is maybe something we'll come back to. I guess the second thing which is related to that is I think there has been a strong and growing recognition of the contribution that journalists can make in not only using data, but also making data and gathering data themselves, and also with community-based organizations, with non-profit organizations, with researchers and so on, which is related to the first point, right? So if we can't take data for granted, journalists can not only report on the making of data, but they can also make their own data, which is really interesting. And there's a section of the book dedicated to that, and I think more coming in that area. And finally, I guess, given the proliferation of sensor data, of platforms, of algorithms, I guess there is much more natively digital data, as we'd call it, available now, which can also be used to investigate the dynamics of platforms and algorithms, which is something that we're seeing a lot more of now than we were, I guess, 10 years ago. But those are three things.
Thanks, Jonathan. Liliana, do you want to add something? You are on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, I could say a couple of quick things. So I guess maybe some changes that have been relevant to my own work and that I found relevant and followed more closely. I guess this entire area of investigations into online misinformation and manipulation using social media data. This has been fascinating to me, also because of my work as a researcher, as a social media researcher, and being used to analyzing social media data to understand different aspects of society. So that's been something that, so I remember Jonathan and I had conversations with the Tau Center at Columbia University about using social media data and digital methods for the purposes of journalism, I think in the early 2000s, and we're talking about developing tools and methods for journalists to use structured data from online platforms and social media to do investigations. But I think that was too early. So that, but I think that really with the online misinformation scandal, the relevance of doing investigations about social media with social media data has become much more evident. And now we see so much interesting work done on this. And we have worked with several organizations, BuzzFeed News, Politico, and we have also worked with First Draft to develop some recipes, so some methods that journalists could use to do these kinds of investigations in their own work. And I guess one other thing, so another change that I have followed more closely, and I guess more in the field of data science, but which I am hoping to see more in the field of data journalism too, is this shift in the understanding of data from this positivist conception of data to more critical and feminist approaches to data. And that's really kind of what we try to do with the entire second edition of the handbook. And this is also the important work that Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein are doing with their concept of data feminism, and which basically has to do with using data to challenge power. And again, we're seeing interesting examples of that in journalism too.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I wonder, Cedric, if you could bring your perspective on the differences that you've seen on training journalists in different areas of the world. What has been changing in the past years?
Honestly, I think that there's still a big imbalance in terms of global North and global South, and even within global North. If you compare, well, organizations like the New York Times and ProPublica and like which have poured a lot of resources in data journalism and a lot of local journalism, a lot of media. Well, there are big fractures, and I think there's something that it's maybe a story of things that have not changed, but I think there's this there's a progress in terms of the sort of first level data journalism, which is how do I use a pie chart, how do I use a line chart to tell a story about the evolution of the pandemic. So that is becoming much more common. And that also tells a story about the acculturation of the audience. And what's interesting is that I tend to read a lot of the comments under articles. I know I shouldn't, but what's interesting is that you find more and more people critiquing the graph that are being used by journalists, saying that not necessarily in terms of technically wrong, but not necessarily telling the right story, or that the legend or the explanation is not adapted to the graph. And so that shows that people are getting used to this kind of what I call base level journalism of basically taking a data set and making a simple visualization with it. So that's interesting, but to go to the point where you do like very powerful investigations like ProPublica or the New York Times, there's a sort of huge amount of effort, and there's a middle place where you're not necessarily in a 12-month investigation that use data sets from multiple sources, but you're not either in a very kind of small day reporting on coronavirus numbers. But this middle place has not been attacked a lot right now, often because people have a hard time telling attractive stories. So there's a question of like, is there a market for that? And also because it's harder to sell this part to media editors, to journalists, because it's easier now today when I come to a training to say, this is important to be able to tell a story with data because of the pandemic, because of all those issues that produce numbers today, and because of all the examples that exist. But and of course we are I am aware, and the person in front of me is aware that, well, their newsroom does not have the funding to be able to launch huge data journalism investigations. But how can we get them to this middle level where data journalism become a culture and a practice, and they are able to insert it everywhere in their work instead of being just this kind of little corner of the newsroom? That's where we things have not changed a lot, and we still struggling, and there's still a lot of efforts for that. And I think it will come a bit much like web journalism was its own corner of the newsrooms in the 90s and the early 20s, and because of a change in demographics of readers, because of a change in how information came to journalists, how information was found, how the market changed, and naturally newsroom had to adapt. And as we see the waves of numbers that come with the pandemic, that come with the discussions about climate change, I think this change in the environment will lead to changes in the future, but they are very slow to come. And one last thing I wanted to say is that one thing that has changed a lot there are many more universities with data journalism programs. They are often very limited. We have to be aware of that and clear. There are My programs, for example, is a module. It's not a specialty. Luckily, it's a module within the main track for journalism students. It's a master's, but it's still not enough. So we focus really on getting them to understand what it means to do data journalism, but we can't expect them to be autonomous data journalists at the end of the process. And so there's still a lot of work to do, but it is a chance and it is a first step that was not there 10 years ago. And I've been teaching for 5 years now. It's my 5th year. And every time I see more students who are motivated and understand the point of data journalism. Like my first 2 years, I had like maybe a third of the class that felt that, yes, at least they should know about it, even if they don't want to necessarily be specialized on it. And most of them were like, oh, that's not really my thing. I'm not really here for that. And now more people, even if they're going to work on the radio or not really planning to do data journalism, understand the value of being able to read a spreadsheet, to tell stories with data. And so that has been a major change in my practice.
Yeah, so your points resonate a lot with my experience here, Cedric. I've seen in Brazil a vibrant data journalism scene and a lot of amazing works produced and published. But if we look inside the newsrooms, most journalists still don't have a basic understanding of how to deal with data in their daily work. And they depend a lot on, you know, the team, the specialized team in the corner, as you said. So it's still a silo in the newsrooms. And I wonder, how can we break this silo logic? We are offering trainings for journalists in the past decade, some, you know, free programs, free tutorials, but I think it's something more structural. What do you think? What is your perspective on this? And I will start with you and then move to Jonathan and Liliana.
Sure. So I think a lot of it will come from demand, much like I was mentioning the example of web journalism, where more people started reading on smartphones and on their computers. And so the demand was created and newsrooms reacted. That led to a lot of transformation. And as I mentioned before, the word that we've been talking a lot about the data revolution for a long time, but it's becoming very much more real now with the events we're going through since I guess the 2008 crisis, with a lot of conflicting numbers. And what's interesting, I think, is that this era of fake news has, of course, created a lot of uncertainty and a lot of challenges in for the work of journalists, but it has also created much more appetite for data from the audience, because a lot of conflicting narratives try to basically build up their credibility. And to do that, they, even more than before, make use of data to try to create a narrative that sort of wins the marketplace of ideas. And that incentivizes, in turn, journalists to be able to make use of data to maintain their own credibility in that sphere. So I think it's a sort of silver lining of these current challenges that we find with the fake news era, that leads us to, that is newsrooms to adapt to the changing environment and transform. But I don't necessarily have, I guess we would have known if there was a magic solution to break those silos inside newsrooms, except saying that it will necessarily change as a matter of time and changing environment. But in terms of driving this change, there is more investment from funders, from philanthropic funders on journalism, especially, again, with fake news. There has been more investment toward investigative journalism, which in turn supports more data journalism and raise the value of it in the eyes of media editors and media owners. But this will be naturally a slow process of getting people to be acculturated to using data in their daily practice.
Jonathan, what do you think?
I think it's a really interesting and challenging question. And I think that sometimes, I mean, maybe part of the reason for these silos is to do with kind of conventional ways of thinking about knowledge work and how those different distinctions are also breaking down, like the distinction between fact and value. So we know now in this moment that facts and values can't be neatly separated. Also the breakdown between nature and culture, right? Like we know now that in this sort of era we're living in, it's not straightforward to separate nature from society and culture, and in all sorts of interesting, scary and complicated ways. And also, I guess we also see that sort of pumping facts into situations which are seen as kind of problematic or towards publics who are unconcerned with facts is not necessarily a workable response to concerns around misinformation and disinformation. I think here it's also important to kind of draw attention to, I think, something that Liliana mentioned earlier, which is the distinction between post-fact and post-truth. Like, and this is also something I think First Draft have been working on. People can have their truths regardless of the facts. So they're not necessarily going to be shaken by kind of being supplied with more facts, which I think is really interesting. But I think the way in which some of these different distinctions have broken down also challenges the just traditional division of labor within the newsroom. So I think people maybe also see that they can't afford to leave, for example, a large collection of leaks to sort of people who are just specialized in computational analysis. The stakes are more than just kind of being able to open a large data set. Just a comment I think that Simon Rogers made about how he went from being this small department to being right next to the sort of editor's desk. And I think that it's also clear that data involves classification, demarcation, interpretation, drawing lines, making decisions, which is not just about these technical skills or these statistical literacy skills. And for that reason, I guess, I think it's gradually becoming clear that data journalism is no longer just a specialism, but something that reporters cannot afford not to engage in some way. And also that the production of data is not just kind of scientific and technical exercise, but also contains many fundamental questions about who we are, how we live together, and how we understand the world around us.
Liliana, do you want to add something to this discussion?
Yes, maybe I could just briefly maybe add another angle to the responses that were provided, which is that while it's true that there are silos, maybe it's also good to just highlight that, of course, movement across these silos is already happening, even if maybe not at the scales that we would like to see. But so from that point of view of how this movement can start happening, again, I think that two easy ways in which this can happen is really if you start with a story that you're interested in and with an issue that you want to investigate and you want to work anyway. If data is what you need to tell that story, you will find a way to incorporate that. So you'll find a way to do that. And here again, I want to point to one of the chapters in the book, which offers a nice story of this, the chapter by Kaylin Barr, which is a really good example of this, where really the journalist just wanted to do an investigation on knife crime, I think it was. And because of various challenges, because they weren't able to find the data that they needed, they basically ended up having to construct their own database. That's not what they wanted to do, so that's not what their project was supposed to be about, but that is what it ended up being because of the state of data around that issue. So I think that, yeah, that is one way in which these things are already happening. And I guess another example or another way is really to start with collaborations And this is also something that we do a lot in our teaching, in our digital methods teaching and data journalism teaching, because it can be intimidating if you take the approach of one person having to be able to do everything, all of the aspects of data collection, data analysis, data visualization, and storytelling, whereas if that is envisaged as something that is being done as a team, where every team member plays to their strengths and does the things that they are best at, that might also be an easier way to start thinking about how to break the silos.
Yes, great points. And you mentioned earlier the lack of work with social data in order to fight misinformation, and that you are trying to explore more this field inside data journalism. And I love the part of Lily's presentation where she mentions that journalists need to find creative ways to deal with uncertainty, because I think uncertainty and misinformation have some kind of intersection. So the question for me is, while uncertainty is beneficial to advancing, the general public's understanding of science, it also opens up space for deniers. So is it possible to give visibility to uncertainty without fueling denials? How to navigate uncertainty and misinformation at the same time? And this is a question for all of you as well. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe I will go back to Cedric and move along.
Yes, if I can add just a little point on the last topic about silos. I think one of the interesting places that we need to watch are radio and TV journalism, because they work differently than the press, which we think about when we talk about data journalism, where someone will produce a story which will be told by someone else. And so that requires a level of collaboration and de-siloing that is different in how the press works. So that's also spaces to look for. So in terms of uncertainty, I think I come back to the point of what are people asking for? So when I teach students, I tell them, at the end of this module, then you will be able to do things that you found fascinating now, but you don't know how to do. You will be able to be a better journalist, even if you never become a data journalist. And you will also have skills that you can that can help make the difference to get a job. But when I train journalists who are already practicing, the main draw to get a journalist, to get an editor to free the time, 2 days of their journalist time to go to a training is this is what readers want to see. If you make more of those stories, then people will trust your media more, will trust your magazine more, will read more. And so that question of what people want and read and what they expect is really, really powerful. And all of that to say that there's a big challenge that we have to face with regard to uncertainty, is that no one likes uncertainty. The state doesn't like uncertainty. The data journalist Nicola Kaiser-Brill long ago published on his blog an example of what he told his students about how the numbers of the census were given, like with a specific amount of number of people living in the territory, even if at every second there's someone leaving and entering the territory, but the census says that there are exactly that many people. And so there is a culture of certainty regard to numbers that has been there for a long time, and that is there to build the credibility of different actors who talk in the public space. And people expect that. And so when you get to talk with a certainty, you you get to rumors. That's what it's associated with rumors, and at the same time, and talking always with certainty enables propaganda, right? So how do you straddle the middle? And that's where you build trust with yourself as a voice in the public space. And how do you build trust today? The kind of common way to go about it is to talk with a voice of certainty, to say, I know what I'm talking about and I've not been proven wrong. And so there's this kind of negative feedback loop where you have to be trusted to avoid being associated with rumor or propaganda, but at the same time, you need to show that you're certain about what you're talking about to be able to be trusted by the general audiences. Of course, in the scientific circles is different. So this is a negative circle that I'm not sure I have an exact answer, but I think what was shown about this exploration of using manual visualization to represent data and sort of like changing the angle of approach of telling a story to be able to insert uncertainty in a way that shows sincerity and that still builds trust is, I think, alternative approaches that we need to investigate. And I think an important last element about this is that the more grounded the stories we tell are, versus larger stories about what's happening in the nation, what's happening in the world. But the more grounded the stories we talk about, communities doing this and that, the easier it is to say, well, we're not sure what's going to happen, or we're not sure how many people were there, but this is a story that really happened because there's a whole narrative. There's a, I was there to see this. That helps sidestep this problem of uncertainty. But whenever we try to kind of build larger narratives about how the country is doing, etc., then it's harder to be uncertain when talking about these topics.
Liliana?
Yes. Yeah, so I guess just as Cedric said, so I don't think we have a solution for that yet, but I think it is the only way forward to explore ways to address and challenge what Cedric called this culture of certainty. So to change the story about what science is, what journalism is, what objectivity is, what facts are, and become accustomed to the fact that there is uncertainty in everything. And really what we need to pay attention to in order to distinguish the way to evaluate different kinds of facts is the equipment and the relations involved in the production of facts. Exactly how to do that, again, I think it's a matter of experimentation that will happen in different, and that is already happening in different places. So for example, some of our colleagues who specialize in data visualization and design, colleagues at Density Design at the Politecnico di Milano, are already experimenting with ways to visualize uncertainty in relation to complex information. So that will be a very interesting space to keep an eye on in the near future.
Yeah, and I wonder if this could, reach more than just a niche, because it's so hard to have the general public understanding, basic graphics. So you can imagine if you come up with, more complex visualizations, how hard it would be to involve the general audience. But I would love to hear Jonathan's perspective on this issue as well.
Yeah, I guess going back to one of the things I think we mentioned earlier, taking this as an opportunity not to take data for granted. I think we should stay with that. I think it's so important to stay with that. I'll say it one more time. It's so important not to take data for granted. What do we mean take for granted, right? Like, we don't assume that we know that the data is a faithful representation of that which it aims to bring to life. We also don't assume that the way in which it's made encapsulates or can stand in for the things that we care about. And we also don't assume that data can correctly abstract from the world the things which matter most in order that we can calculate, compute and decide somehow in advance of debate, discussion and the sort of normal goings on in democratic life and society. So we cannot take data as the foundation which is produced in advance of the messiness of the social realities that we're engaging in. I think this is such an important point and something that's become very clear during the pandemic, right? I mean, all of these graphs, dashboards, numbers, claims were, as Cedric was alluding to, widely contested and politicized in a way which I think ultimately has been very difficult in many ways, but we can somehow build on and take advantage of in order to build, as Liliana was saying, a more realistic understanding of how data operates and holds together social life. There's a lovely phrase from the sociologist of finance, Donald Mackenzie, who says that models are not just cameras that show us a picture of life. They're also engines which can reshape and change it. They're living and dynamic systems, not just kind of ways of producing accurate pictures. And one of our colleagues in France, the sociologist Bruno Latour, who's done a lot of work on climate change, also did a wonderful interview. I'd highly recommend looking at this. A wonderful interview in the New York Times, where he was described as the post-truth philosopher. And he was saying that one of the things that we can try to do in this situation where also climate science is so widely contested is to build up a better understanding of the fragility of the making of facts and the making of claims and the making of models, and to be more honest that the previous quite exaggerated claims about certainty that were made often by non-scientists about how science work should be in a way abolished in favor of a much more kind of realistic appraisal of all of the background work and all of the complexity that goes into trying to understand our future. And we don't need to wait for certainty in order to take action, as I think has been a major critique of the COP, the IPCC climate change meetings. I think they've been widely criticized by people who are studying them for waiting too much for scientific certainty and deferring action because of that. So I guess just to, sorry, there's a couple more things. Moving away from the notion that data are just produce representations of the world, and looking how data can be sites of negotiating how we relate to each other. And in the book, there's these wonderful chapters by Helen Ferran, for example, on telling the stories of a number, how it's produced and how it circulates. But also there's a lovely chapter on data as a way to surfacing memories of how we relate to trees in the city, which I think kind of is a really nice job at explaining how data can be about relationships and how we live together, not only how we calculate where we are based on sort of this production of certainty. And I think many of the projects to do with making data, whether it's to do with people who have been killed by police, whether it's to do with looking at the coal plant as a source of carbon, not just the country or the average person, but looking at how not every energy source is the same, and coal plants play a disproportionate role, as we've now seen over the discussions of the last few weeks in relation to climate change, and sort of the messiness of data rather than just the cleanness of data in producing representations of things. In other words, how much data is fundamentally about how we live together and not just about kind of producing faithful representations in advance of debate.
Yeah, I love Bruno Latour's perspective on science and how he kind of reframed the way that science is, you know, defined and what is spread. And I think that the challenge here is what Cedric mentioned, related to the culture of certainty, how to bring these different angles while people are super angry about uncertainty right now. They don't want to have it. And with COVID, we've seen a lot of this, and especially how this fuel misinformation. And that brings me a question from our audience. We have a question from Claudia Girelli, which is, will data journalism be largely responsible for fighting disinformation? What do you think? What is the role of data journalism in this scenario that we have right now?
Maybe could I, Nata, if I could just add one very quick thing to the previous question and to exactly this last note that you finished on, that how do you do that in an accessible way and in a way that doesn't make people angry? Because I think it really, again, points to, again, Mona Chalabi's work with sketching with data, which addresses both the point of accessibility and the role of emotions. So yeah, again, just to remind that that's a really, really, really good example, which, yeah, we really love how she manages to integrate and make space for uncertainty in data journalism work.
Yeah, and please go ahead and if you want to speak about this last question. Actually, we had someone from our audience commenting about Mona Chalabi's work, that Mateo Silva loves Mona Chalabi sketches. So that's a great example.
I think it really struck me. I think Liliana, you were involved in also this empirical work really on, I guess, yeah, this is maybe something we're still very much working out and would love to kind of continue to discuss with you all. I think it's a really substantial, sort of difficult thing. It's like, how can we contribute to a different kind of culture of empiricism? So not a culture of empiricism which is based on sort of this very sort of Enlightenment sort of notion of the production of the fact, but one which takes into account the kinds of conditions in which facts are produced as part of the story. And I guess just to give a really concrete illustration of this in relation to misinformation, Liliana, I think, led a piece of work looking at how misinformation claims and responses to them, which were debunking those claims, traveled on social media. And she found that mostly they just resonated in very different groups. So often the sorts of responses to misinformation claims were just not going to the same groups where those claims are resonating. And I guess this is what I mean by kind of sort of a different culture of empiricism, which is taking into account things like circulation, social context, cultural context. And it feels like another starting point for thinking about the relatability of data, not just as a form of, how do I put it, kind of disciplining people to think correctly according to facts which pre-exist, but as a form of experimentation and hopefully democratic engagement around what matters to us and how we live together again, is to look at the everyday practices which we all know and relate to, like drawing lines, making lists, drawing a table. I think, again, drawing in Mona Chalabi's work is such an important part of this, making connections between things. Like, these are very basic acts which are really relatable and at the sort of foundation of what it means to kind of create structured relations which we can learn with, which I think is another way of thinking about data, not only kind of calculating, computing, correlating, but also thinking about relationships and taking measure in a way which isn't only based on precision and certainty.
I like what you mentioned, this idea of basically experimenting more with data and not just like telling people how to think. And there's when you go back to some principles, pillars of how you do science, you don't just say if I do this, this works, but you also say if I do it differently, it doesn't work. And that's why I'm sure that the fact that I do this and it works is a scientific fact. And that's something we don't see in journalism because it's quite hard to do that with just a narrative. But data enables us to be able to use this narrative a bit differently in terms of, okay, so the data shows this, but what if we try to wrangle the data in a different way? What is the result? Does that make sense to you as a reader? Like giving this multiple perspective is also a way that data can be used and experimented with, and to create a different narrative where you, instead of sort of putting the facts there and giving the correct interpretation, which is like the principle of propaganda, is that everybody agrees on the fact, but you give a specific interpretation on the fact. But if we are able to do it in a way where you properly engage the reader in like co-constructing the interpretation and the insights by showing what kind of results are observed, what kind of results seem more to make sense, then I think there are some interesting things that can be done. And data journalism specifically has possibilities to be exploring that sphere of possible.
Yeah, and maybe even showing the readers their own biases, right? Before giving the data and giving the news, just, you know.
There was this really nice series by the New York Times, like You Draw It, right?
Yeah.
That was really great.
Yeah, I love these pieces. All right, so we have just 4 minutes more, unfortunately, because I had so many questions that I will left for us to, you know, discuss in another moment. But anyway, I'd love to give you some space to your final remarks. So please feel free to add any other points that you have for this kind of conversation, and, you know, just say whatever you feel you need to close this session. Thank you so much for this amazing discussion. It was great to talk to you. And I will start with Liliana.
Yeah, so I guess just to say, well, thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, I'm so happy that we are able to do this. And I guess I could just maybe take 1 minute to give a very short response to the question from the audience, which, yeah, thank you for that question on the role of data journalism in reporting on and investigations around online manipulation and misinformation. So yes, definitely there will be a big role for journalism and data journalism in relation to this in the future. And I guess to say that we have, Jonathan and I have been working over the last couple of years to develop resources that could be used by journalists, activists, and researchers interested to do this. So there is a field guide to fake news and other information disorders, which provides methodological recipes for how you could use social media data and digital tools to study the circulation of online misinformation. More recently, we did a series of, again, methodological recipes or tutorials for how journalists and others could study the circulation of anti-vaccination sentiments online. So yeah, those resources are there. At the same time, there has also been the argument that has been made that if all of us invest all our time and resources in studying online manipulation and misinformation, this might mean that there is less time and resources and space on the public agenda for other important issues that are happening. So that's also something to have in mind.
Jonathan?
I guess I just wanted to show this image, which I guess you have seen, but which is on the, it's a Sarah's C sculpture, which we've chosen to be on the front of the image, again, to kind of emphasize this point of data journalism as a practice which is concerned with relations, not only representations. And it's often composed of diverse elements, which are kind of held together through fragile networks and maintained as a result of care and background work, which is often not appreciated. So I guess the closing thing I wanted to say was it's so inspiring to be invited to come and talk with you today. And if you go back to, you know, the very beginning of things like the UN Statistical Agency, a lot of work which led to the making of these big numbers, which we now take for granted as indicators of the state of the world, was made through these sorts of informal associations. And this is the kind of informal transnational coordination that I think is more important to think about today, perhaps more clearly than in other years we would take those forms of transnational coordination for granted. And I guess just as a sort of closing thing, taking seriously that responsibility to work with communities of the affected, to take their issues, concerns, frictions and troubles as a starting point, always in the work that we do, and to think of how data may serve as not only a way of conveying facts, but also as a site of assembly of care, concern, solidarity and mobilization. And I really look forward to working with you all and continuing these conversations to learn from each other about how we might use data to compose a common work.
Thank you, Jonathan. Cedric?
So two little points. I think we talk a lot about what can data journalism can do for us, but in a lot of places in the world, the question is how can we make data journalism a thing, because it's not a thing in many places of the world. So we have to kind of remember as well that it's not there. We're talking from a privileged perspective. And the second thing is that there is one place where we are, well, people are happy for us to tell them how to think, and that's universities. And this is also where we can embed data journalism as a core element of journalism practice and change the culture, starting with the sprouts. So I love teaching students, and they are more and more enthusiastic every year. So let's also push for more of data journalism education. Thank you all for inviting me.
Thank you so much for your participation. The session was great, and thank you all for being with us. The conference will continue till Saturday, so keep the attention to our program, and thanks again for being with us. Bye. Have a great evening, you from Europe, and a great rest of afternoon here in Brazil. Bye.